Welcome to Hope Academy. My name is Mr. O, and today I'm going to be going over a general overview on critical reading. So the purpose of this video is to go over different type of strategies available in order for you to be able to get a better score, if not work towards the perfect score on the critical reading section. But before I do so, I do want to state that the main resource I'll be using today is from the Practice Exam 1 on the College Board website, the first section of the very first exam. My purpose is not to go through the whole critical reading section. I'll just be using the very first passage sort of as an example while I explain sort of the breakdown on critical reading and, go over an overview on strategies and such. So in front of you, if you notice on the first section, it states that it's 65 minutes and 52 questions. So in a more logical sense, if you think about it, you don't have that much time. If we were to calculate how many minutes do you have per question, we assume that you have a little bit over a minute per each question. But be aware that that also includes you being able to read through the critical reading section and passages and to be able to, go through it fast. But that being stated, I do want to discuss a few different strategies that I have seen when I tutor students along the way, but along with different type of strategies that do work for some people, sometimes it doesn't work for other people. It really depends on which strategy you really focus on, along with what you prefer or are comfortable with. So in front of you is this passage that I have 1 through 10. The first thing that I do want to really emphasize and make sure you understand is the fact that this little passage right here, if you notice right here, is actually one of the most important parts of this exam. And I really want to emphasize this because a lot of times I see sometimes students skip this portion right here, this little italicized or the mini font description, and then they just jump to the passage because they're feeling like they're rushed. They want to save time on understanding the passage. But a lot of times this portion right here might not help sometimes, but sometimes it actually provides you the context that you actually need in order to do well or understand the passage in the first place. So I do want to side note that by saying that always read this portion right here, this little passage. And so I want to start with that. I now want to talk about generically passages in general around different strategies that I have seen students do. So I do want to go over that on a separate piece of paper, and I'll come back to this passage. So the overview, and I'm going to write overview of SAT critical reading. Underline that. Duly note that critical reading, I'm also going to call it as CR. I want to make sure I didn't mark anything in the back. So the overview of SAT critical reading. I do want to emphasize that I am overviewing different strategies that students use. I'm not going to claim that one strategy is better than the other because each person has a different type of mindset. The first strategy that I have seen, and this is not as common I've seen, is students that do this. They actually read very thoroughly. Over the passage, then do questions. So what I mean by reading the passage thoroughly is that let's assume that you have certain number of passages, like several passages to go through within a section and such. The part is that a lot of times, let's say that this passage, and if you note right here, is 1 through 10. So technically, you should be allocating 10, maybe 11 minutes or 12 minutes at most on this portion. But let's say that 1 through 10, you really want to spend time on reading the passage. I have seen students, what they actually do is that they sometimes spend maybe up to even 5 minutes reading and really thoroughly practically memorizing the passage, and they go through this and really understand the passage, remember every little detail that comes into this passage, and then they spend 5 minutes just going through the multiple choice. Be aware that in a circumstance like this, you basically only have 30 seconds per question. But I have seen students that do this sort of strategy and found it beneficial for them. And the main reason why is that so students have said that when they do it this way, they don't have to flip back. They don't have to waste time flipping back and forth. And a lot of times that skill is attained from being able to memorize information real quick and being able to regurgitate it in a timely fashion. And so that's the first strategy I've seen. Is not very common, but I do want to note that type of strategy does work for some students. The other strategy that I do want to note is the strategy that I personally do most of the times and many other people do. And it's the strategy of skimming the passages, skim the passage, skim over the passage. Then do questions while flipping back and forth. So a lot of times, yes, you'll see that students will do is that rather than spending that 5 minutes, those crucial minutes, reading the passage so thoroughly and such, sometimes people do is that they actually go through it real quick. They run through it, they skim through it, maybe spend 2-3 minutes on that passage. And then they run through the passage, as in they go back and forth. If they see like a passage, they tell you like a specific type of question. You flip back to that portion, you read over it, you flip back and forth, and sort of think through it and make sure that you understand it. And so this is the more common type of strategy, and this is the type of strategy that I personally used when I was doing the SAT critical reading section. And so now I'm going to teach a sort of strategy that does help me personally do these type of passages. Do note that you could change it a little bit to your own style and taste and whatever not. But I will go over this passage real quick and show you how I go about skimming this, but in an efficient manner in which it will help you make sure that you do well in the critical reading. So how I usually teach students is this. So I usually go through this, and whenever I do each passage, so let's say I start right here when Akira came directly, breaking old traditions and whatever not. So each paragraph or 2 paragraphs that I read, I actually write a little bit of notes. And I also do a strategy that's very common is called annotations. Annotation basically means that you underline the key words or key statements in a passage that especially emphasizes a certain tone. It might tell you the main idea of the passage. It might tell you, oh, this passage is going to be a more positive one, maybe a negative one. It might have a certain leaning. And so when I'm going through this, I'll show you how I do this real quick. I'm not going to per se go so thoroughly upon this whole passage per se, but I will show you just this page. How do I do this? So I'm going to go ahead and do this. Here came back breaking old tradition. What was that? Had he followed before? Had his mother speak to his father, go between, which he more receptive? Came on a winter's eve, repented of the door, so she thought him only the wind. Okay. The maid knew better. Thought him only Scotted. So something about person, descriptions, okay? The maid was looking to go to her desk. She was who is that? Okay, so introduces themselves. Okay. Okay. World and glistening surface, description. So when I'm doing this type of passage, it's important to note that I'm only writing key few words, because if I want to save time, I don't want to describe the whole passage. I just want to talk about it real quick. Don't forget my disruption, urgency is voice. So there's dim lights and certain come inside business hotel. I don't want to trouble you. I want to approach you more properly. So opportunity to go to America as a dentist. Big move for a person. So how maio followed. No preferences, such sensitive from what speech, how children so early. So urgency so early, so about this thing. Okay. So right now, of course, I didn't continue reading it, and there's actually more that continues on behind this. But at least from what I've noticed, what I noticed was that it sort of talks it's a lot of description basis around this individual named Akira. And the idea is that what I read was that there's a lot of description, and this person, aka, comes up to her and tells her sort of that this person's going to this college, this person was from this college, and that he's going to be going to the United States, and then she's not very certain what is exactly going on. So a few things, if you notice what I did underline a certain keywords and duly note that along the way when I'm flipping back and forth, depending on the question, sometimes I pick up on details. So this is not the most perfect, way I could describe it right now. But I did mention a few things. So I mentioned like person's descriptions discussing that the person discusses themselves around this point. There's more description around like just the setting and such. And then it talks about some sort of big moment for that stranger or that person that she heard the name of but she doesn't know, but that she doesn't know exactly what's going on because she asked the individual, why is it so relevant or pertinent to me that you tell me this information? And so this is sort of what was very helpful, because when I go to the next portion, and I'm going to flip right here, and I go to the next portion right here, these questions will sort of talk about these different type of themes, which I'm going to go over the different sort of type of themes that I have seen on critical reading, and how it is pretty predictable for critical reading after a point what type of questions will come out, so that you will be more prepared and ready to predict and sort of know the type of questions that will come out, so that you could answer the questions correctly. But that being stated, the sort of things that I noticed, like for example, if I go back to line like these two type of choices and whatever not, it will sort of be easier for me to find out what they're talking about, especially since I could flip back and forth along the way. And so, for example, if I try to do number one, which of the following choices best describes what happens in the passage, I don't know, it's not argument, because the key things for me is that when I read certain words, strong words that come out, I know do not work for this passage. So B receives a surprising request. Okay, maybe one character reminisces about choices she has made over the years. No, this is not something about reminiscing. If you notice, she's a little bit confused what's going on. One character criticizes another character for pursuing an unexpected path of whatever not, right? And so for me, I feel that I didn't read enough of this passage, and so I can't guess automatically. But I could tell you that my assumption most likely is that it's going to be B. Okay? But yeah, this is just something I'm assuming just based on what I know already, and that's why it is important to run through this and skim through everything. But that's sort of how I was able to go about doing this type of question. But that being stated, I do want to also discuss the type of questions that do come out on the critical reading portion, so that I could help you out a little bit on predicting the type of questions that come out. So, but I do also want to side note, before continuing and discussing these type of questions, there's one key important thing I must mention when you're doing critical reading. And this is personally for me when I've seen people do these exams and how well they do and whatever not. So the key thing is this, I must note. And I'm going to do this in like sort of a red pink color. Note, do not, in my opinion, do not look at the critical reading or CR, the critical reading passage questions first. So what I mean by that is that even before you do this passage, even before you go and read this passage or whatever, some people I've seen in the tutor, when I tutor, do is that they flip to the other page and they're like, okay, I see these type of questions, I'm going to look for them, be automatically to look into this passage and be able to compare basically what sort of things do I need depending on the question that's provided on this passage. So for example, what I mean by that is that if, for example, I was trying to figure out a type of inference question that I could flip back and forth and so on. And so if or other things, like if I have a main idea, what I can do is that I can look at these clues that I provided right here, the sort of few words in the passage sort of thing, in order to figure out how to be able to do this question appropriately and such. But that being stated, this is the strategy that I recommend, just because most people do work in this mindset where they don't remember every single detail possible. But if you have the few words provided on the paragraphs on the sides, then what you can do is that you can use this type of information in order to be able to answer the question quicker and to save time on not having to reread everything every single time. And so this is the strategy that I wanted to talk about. But that being stated, I do also want to talk about few other things. And so I'm going to go ahead on a new sheet of paper, explain the type of questions that do come out on this passage. As you notice, I did mention some things already about about getting the main idea and such like that. And so I do want to provide you with a list of specific terminologies that I would use, or I mean, not per se me, or terminologies that, or ideas that are very important for you to know for the multiple choice questions. So what do I mean by that? So a lot of times when you're doing these type of questions, you do want to look for specifically these type of questions will always come out. There's always a question on the main idea. So like the bigger picture. So like, is the passage talking about her feelings? Is it talking about the scenario in general? What is it actually just talking about? So that's what we mean by the main idea. A lot of times there's also questions usually on vocabulary. And when I talk about vocabulary, that means that, for example, they will cite a specific word in the passage, such as like, oh, what does the word malevolent mean in this passage, and so on. And there's usually a type of question like that in one or two different passages. Sometimes they use more, just dependent on the type of passage you're reading. Other type of questions you'll also see is inference. So inference means that it's a lot more deeper understanding around the concept. So for example, if we have these two passages, what can we infer? What is the purpose of this passage? What is the author trying to give as his sort of message? But it's not very explicit. Usually it's a very implied, or it's sort of like you do have to figure out yourself what the author's trying to lead on to. And so that's another type of question you do want to know. Another thing is tone. And so a lot of times tone is influenced by vocabulary. It is influenced by the main idea. And a lot of times you figure out, if you know the main idea to a passage, usually you know what the tone is. So for example, is it very positive? Is the person being negative? Is there like a sort of confusion that's going on? Like what happened in the passage right here, that the person was a little bit confused along the way, and so on. And so it's important for us to know that that's another type of question that can come out. Comparison / transition is another type of question that could come out on the SAT. Usually this type of question comes out when there's a comparison type passages, as in, passage 1, passage 2, there's two different stories. Usually they're different perspectives. Sometimes they're not different perspectives. But usually they'll ask you about comparison between these two passages. What do you see might conflict from author's 1's belief versus author's 2 belief, and so on. And the last type of question I usually see is something based on citation. And so what I mean by citation is that usually it means that if we look at a passage, it might be like, oh, line 78 of this passage is talking about. And the reason why I like doing this sort of format that I was talking about before right here is that when I do this sort of format, it lets me get the main idea faster. It lets me get the citation done. So if I say 77 and I look at that paragraph, that using my strategy that I was talking about, and I look at the passage and I say, hey, they talk about, X, Y, and Z, then I know that it's going to be that answer, the X, Y, and Z. And so that's sort of why I really encourage this type of strategy. But that being stated, it is really dependent on the individual, and you do what you think or you feel is the best strategy for yourself. And so to continue on, there's another thing I do want to side note along the way. And it's the fact that when you are doing this SAT preparation and such, I do want to emphasize the vocabulary for SAT is still 100% relevant. Okay, and now I'm going to emphasize what I mean by that. So the part is that with the shift between the old and the new SAT, some of the questions they did take out were these very vocabulary-based questions where there will be these gaps between words and such, and then you have to figure out what word fits into the context. And they did remove that, and there happens to be sort of like a little trend or thing going on where some students actually think that because that portion is gone, vocabulary is not as important, that they don't need to study the words. They don't need to worry about the words or like spend so much time memorizing a bunch of words. That I am completely against that belief. Because when I read these passages, a lot of times they actually use a lot of these SAT verbiage still in the passages. And a lot of times it ends up becoming some of the vocabulary based questions in the SAT reading. And I also noticed that a lot of times when people are struggling on critical reading, I myself actually struggled on critical reading before. One of the things that really helped me get really good or to get a really high score on the critical reading is the fact that I've started memorizing SAT vocabulary words. And it is very tedious. It does take a lot of time. And I do recommend memorizing thousands of words if possible. But that being stated, yes, it is something that's still very important. And I recommend people to doing so. And if as soon as possible, if you can, start doing so. If it even means you making, vocabulary cards or using Quizlets or using different programs to sit down, spend 30 minutes, maybe even like 10 minutes, even if you don't have that much time, but even 10 minutes to memorize like a set of words every day and just making sure you keep reviewing those words and keep making sure you know those words, then that's the way you're going to be able to do well on this SAT critical reading portion. And make sure you start looking around. You could find a lot of resources online that do help you memorize it. It is dependent on the person. And I've seen some students actually improve a lot on SAT vocabulary by forcing themselves to use it in their daily diction or their daily language. And the reason why they do that is because the more you use that word and the more accustomed you are to seeing that word, the better you become at just, using that word in your passages. It's sometimes even better for you to improve on your SAT writing even. And so that's where my recommendation comes in. But that being stated, it's not only, this strategy that 100% will work all the time and whatever not. There are tricks to help yourself improve on the vocabulary. And these are some examples. Like I'm going to provide like 2 different type of examples as to where roots, or as we call them, the Latin roots, do come in and play a very important part. And it could save you a lot of time on memorizing a lot of redundant based words. So let me explain what I mean. So one of the roots front roots that I usually see is the term BEN dash. And for those that do SAT and such, we see this word a lot, and we know that automatically it has to stand for something around good, around something about being good or helping others, or just generally of good nature. And there's a lot of examples that do help us recognize that this is actually the case. For example, the word beneficial or benefit or beneficial are very similar. They both mean the same thing, which means that it's doing good to other people. And so if you see other words that may not be as common, that you might have just seen come up randomly, like for example benign or benign as some people will pronounce it, this is a word that does mean of good nature and whatever not. A lot of times when you're doing this vocabulary, you don't need to 100% memorize the perfect diction or idea behind the word. You just need to at least get an idea what the word means so that you could use it in the context, or so that you can use it in your essays later on. And so that's one common root that does exist. Another root that does exist is the word mal. And if you think about other examples of mal, there's like the word like malevolent. Malevolent would mean doing bad. Malice also means doing harm to other people and such. And so if you see, there is a certain pattern that does exist in certain words. It's not 100% perfectly this case, but so this strategy does help you cut down a lot of certain words that you might not know, and you can sort of guesswork it so that you don't have to spend so much time worrying about, that word or what does it mean and so on. And so that sort of concludes my explanations around critical reading strategies. But that being stated, critical reading is something where there's no perfect shortcut or way for you to automatically raise your score to a perfect score, or, a claim that you're ready for the exam perfectly and so on. But it is something where if you keep practicing it, you do improve. And now I'm going to discuss a little bit about just certain strategies that will help you improve your score. So when I talk about strategies, what I mean by that is not per se what I just been talking about, like, know words, notice these type of, terminologies and such. I do want to go back to why I did talk about these type of, these things right here, these type of concepts. What happens is that a lot of times when I see people studying for the critical reading portions or studying for SAT in general, what they do is that they do a test, they go through it, they find mistakes, they're like, oh, I got number 17 wrong, I got number 21 wrong, and I got number 28 wrong. They look at it and they're like, okay, let's go to the next test. And there's a problem with this piece. A lot of times when you're making mistakes, you'll actually start noticing that you're making the same mistake again and again. So, for example, if you, in the beginning, especially your 400, 500 mistakes, you're scoring in the 400, 500s, A lot of times that's not because of you not understanding, like specific type of concepts. That's more of you needing to improve getting the main idea and improving your reading skills, per se. But once you start hitting the 600 range, when you start hitting that range, it becomes more and more consistent that it's not an issue anymore about you getting the main idea or the bigger picture usually. Usually it's the idea that, for example, let's say inference is my problem, right? I noticed a lot of times students, what happens is that they will get almost every inference question wrong, or if not, they'll get inference and let's say they get tone questions wrong also, right? That usually does happen where you'll start noticing there's a pattern in your mistakes. Once in a while, of course, you might get like a main idea question wrong or randomly some other type of question wrong. And usually that's just because, like there were two answers and you're really stuck, or you're not in the best conditions. And so you make the mistakes happen, and that is fine. But what happens that I start noticing students, they do is that they get mistakes like this and they start noticing them, and then sometimes they don't do anything about it, and which is the big issue. What you need to do is that once you get these mistakes for inference and tone or whatever type of question you get wrong, you note it, you look at your mistake, you look at the passage again, and you analyze as to why you got it wrong and what can you do better next time. Are you looking at the question too closely? Are you generalizing too much? Are you choosing just answers that just you reflect later on and you realize are pretty silly? And so that sort of strategy does help. And it's also very important for me to know that you should be using old tests that you took a while back and redoing them again. Erase the mistakes, do whatever you need to do to be able to take that exact same exam again and do it again. Because what's great about doing this strategy is that once you do your test the second time, you could actually compare your mistakes from the first time to your second time and see what mistakes are you making again. Because if you're making that mistake again, chances are you did not improve, or you did not improve on that type of question, or you're not understanding that mistake still. And so those are different strategies that do exist on critical reading. That being stated, thank you so much for watching this video. Please do subscribe to our YouTube channel, like our Facebook page, follow us on Twitter. And please do leave comments below if you have any questions about critical reading, about strategies, so that I could potentially make a new video for you guys on this and elaborate more on different type of strategies. And so I hope you have a wonderful day.